that's one of the things I really want to capture, and talk about a little bit more, this idea of to what degree and to what level of accuracy can an artificial intelligence software, mimic empathy. Because if we're going to look at, what's going on under the hood and what these machines are, they are inherently different from the way humans are built, especially on emotional questions, right? Human emotion is more a neurochemical issue than anything else, and a perceptual motor issue than anything else, right? There is no machine learning process that is equivalent to the neurochemistry of the amygdala and its associated systems and effects on the rest of our brains and bodies, right? What there is software systems that analyze enormous amounts of data for correlations that can better attune their responses to your emotional expressions such that you learn something important and actionable from those expressions. And maybe those mirrors and those mimics, the best way to use them for mental health and therapy related applications is as this kind of feedback mirror for your own self-understanding. Because again, one of the myths of AI is that they are replicating and building something superior to humans. And I think one of the ideological problems with a lot of the business culture and technical culture and engineering culture that is developing artificial intelligence is that because they have been working with machine intelligence for so long, and if you look back at the history of cybernetics, conceiving of organic life and human thought and the components of organic thinking and perception as machine learning like, and as the creation and reinterpretation of codes, that has become something that they have reduced the neurochemistry of emotion and the experience of emotion to, instead of trying to effectively engage. There is a notion that they are trying to replicate.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's, again, the question of like, how can we effectively code emotion and subjectivity into AI and consciousness when we can't even articulate and verbalize what those things are? How could you possibly make an algorithm for it? I always give the example to my students of like, describe how to walk. So you can walk, sure, you can all walk fine, but the actual process is very hard to articulate. Like, how am I even making it go, So when you break it down to that layer of like, how would you actually make this a series of commands and prompts that you try and make something else actualize? If we, how would you reduce consciousness to that, If we can't even do that in language, how we can do that in code?
Yeah. And it's because the code itself, at the very least, like, machine learning code, because it's one thing to look at, say, genetic codes and protein structures and the interaction between protein structures as being, codes articulated at different macro and micro levels, and there being parallelisms of structure between, say, DNA and proteins, and parallelisms of structure between DNA, proteins, and all of the systems that produce our sort of phenotypical traits, right? Your height, the shape of our beards, our hair, our nose shape, skin color, propensity to develop heart disease by the time we hit 75, right? All of those traits, right? There are ways in which we can understand that as codes interacting with codes, interacting with codes. But the question is, are we accidentally, in our understanding of this, oversimplifying the code-based nature of certain aspects of human life and of, as I was saying on the last episode of the podcast, organic life? I'm not even talking about the humans. Because let's be fair, if we're talking about emotions, we're talking about like basically every animal.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, it's an interesting challenge. It's an interesting space, like there's so much potential there in that integration of these things that don't often make sense to go together, right? This like hyper rational imagined logic of the machine world and this sort of irrational flows of emotive space, and I think trying to combine those things, it often feels like a water and oil type problem where you're sort of like, how do you actually get these things to work together in symbiotic ways that aren't flattening? Right? Because the act of processing, interpreting is always going to reduce complexity. The act of us both trying now to use language to describe our thoughts is already reducing what we're thinking, and I wonder how much of that reduction is taking place in this space too. And, the challenge is always like, it has to almost evolve in tandem with some of the technical limits and capacities at a material level too. Like we said before, like the tech has to be cheap and durable and affordable and ergonomic. And if it isn't those things, like, there's a threshold and people won't take it up.
Yeah. You're just not going to get the data necessary if the sheer inconvenience of getting the data becomes so cumbersome that we can't take this on without already being incredibly emotionally committed to it, even just simple things like securing a podcast guest is sometimes a complex negotiation between building enthusiasm and convenience, right? Some people are willing to, drive across town in ridiculous traffic to get to a recording session on time. And some people are like, no, right? And that's something that every podcast host goes through, especially when they're working out of a fixed studio. And it's something that, is not only common to everybody in the media and journalism space, but it's common to every bit of human experience and human desire. Right? How do you overcome the reluctance? How do you make something convenient enough for people to incorporate it into their lives? And something as tricky and difficult as trying to build an AI system that can convincingly act in an empathetic way. Like, there might be so much data that you need to collect for that. And you have to be so careful about how all of it is interpreted. The amount of I honestly, there's a tendency in what I call Silicon Valley thinking to presume that the solution to problems are much simpler than they really are. An example that I can think of is some of the failures around the Sidewalk Labs project here in Toronto, where we filmed the new intelligence and where we are all based. Which was Google's attempt to build a smart city that would have been incredibly convenient for everyone, but involved so many embedded sensors in the architecture of the community that it amounted to, number one, a hilariously intense invasion of privacy if the whole thing had actually been built. And number two, just, yes, it would have been convenient, but there were so many other issues about potentially being, people who did not have the means to participate in sharing data being shut out of the community was another issue too.
Well, I think this for me is the primary question always, right? It's just like the future is already here, right? It's just not evenly distributed, like the films that we grew up watching, all those science fiction films are set now in the 2020s, we have many of the technologies that those films could only imagine. The problem is just that we all don't have access to those things, right? Yeah, it's just, there's those inequities and those hierarchies are just being remapped onto this space.
Yeah.